Let's begin the unit of evolution with chapter 22, which talks about Darwin. On November 24th, 1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species. He had it years before, but did not publish it out of fear of the church. Darwin noted that current species are descendants of ancestral species, so evolution can be defined by Darwin's phrase, descent with modification. Evolution is viewed as both a pattern and a process. So Darwin's ideas came from research on early Earth, which contradicted the church. Here is a timeline of the important historical events that influenced Darwin's work. So let's talk about a few prior historical events that influenced Darwin. There was Aristotle, who viewed species as fixed and unchanging. Then we had the Old Testament of the Bible. It said that species were individually designed by God and therefore perfect. Then we have Linnaeus, who is the founder of taxonomy, which is the branch of science that is concerned with classifying organisms. He is known as the father of taxonomy, and according to him, adaptations that organisms had were evidence that God designed each for a specific purpose, and so that's how he classified organisms. He also developed the binomial format for naming species, for example, Homo sapien for humans. Now, the study of fossils laid the groundwork for Darwin's ideas. Fossils are usually found in sedimentary rock, which appear in layers, or what we call strata. Here's a figure that shows sedimentary rock with different strata layers. As you see, the fossils found at the younger layers are more recent, while the fossils found at the older strata layers are going to be older fossils. Now, Georges Cuvier was a French scientist that was responsible for helping develop paleontology, or the studying of fossils. Now, Cuvier opposed this idea of gradual evolutionary change, so he came up with the idea of catastrophism to explain why there are differences in fossils. Catastrophism is the idea that each boundary between strata represents a catastrophic event that occurred. Next, we have geologists Hutton and Lyell, who studied changes in the Earth's surface. They came up with the idea of uniformitarianism, which states that the mechanisms of change are constant over time, so the changes are uniform. Next, we have Lamarck. Lamarck had the idea of use and disuse. If you use something, then it will be passed on to your offspring. If you don't use it, it will slowly fade away and you don't pass it to your offspring. Now, it is important to know that this idea is not supported by evidence. For example, Arnold Schwarzenegger used his big muscles a lot, so when he had children, the children should be born with big muscles, and we know this is not true. Another example is this bonsai tree here in this picture. It was trained to grow as a dwarf by pruning and shaping. However, the seed from this tree will produce an offspring of normal size. So these are both examples of how acquired traits cannot be inherited. Let's begin concept 22.2. So there was some doubts about the stability of species before Darwin's ideas. So let's talk about Darwin. Throughout his entire life, Charles Darwin was constantly interested in nature. Darwin first studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where he was unsuccessful. Then he went to Cambridge University in the United Kingdom to study theology. After graduating, he took an unpaid position on a ship called the Beagle that was taking a 5-year trip around the world. Darwin traveled on the Beagle, where he observed and collected many specimens both of plants and animals, and throughout his travel he drew things in his book and kept many notes. Darwin was influenced by Lyell's principle of geology and thought that Earth was more than 6,000 years old, and his interest in geographic distribution of species was kindled by a stop at the Galapagos Islands west of South America. There he hypothesized that the species from South America had colonized the Galapagos Islands. Here is just a map of the voyage around the world that the Beagle took, where Darwin observed many different species. During his trip, Darwin observed various adaptations due to many diverse environments. This led him to begin to really start asking true questions why there was these differences in adaptations. So now we can go back to the studies of Darwin and really see how these adaptations are related to the environment. For example, the Galapagos finches. If you look at the beak shape, the beak size, and their color pattern, you can see that each is adapted to a specific environment, more specifically, the food source they eat. So in 1844, Darwin wrote a long essay that described natural selection as the mechanism that causes descent with modification, but he was reluctant to show it publicly in fear of uproar. Then, in 1858, Wallace sent Darwin a manuscript about the same thing, so Darwin quickly finished The Origin of Species and published it the next year. Now, natural selection is the process where individuals with favorable inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. Darwin developed three main ideas in his book. First, the unity of life. Next, the diversity of life. Then, the match between organisms and their environment. Now, Darwin did not use the word evolution. Instead, Darwin used the phrase descent with modification. He said that all organisms are related through descent from an ancestor, that they are modified as they descend from an ancestor. Also, he did not use the phrase survival of the fittest. This phrase was made up by a newspaper reporter. Now, it is extremely important to remember that survival of the fittest is not accurate. It does not matter if you survive. It only matters if you make offspring. Now, in the Darwinian view, the history of life is like a tree with branches representing the diversity of different organisms. Here is a cladogram. A cladogram is a diagram that shows the relationship between organisms. Now, in the Darwinian view, the history of life cladogram shows how all the organisms are all descendants from a common ancestor, that they all start off at the same branch, which you can see right here. They all come from the same ancestor. As the populations branch off, this represents the diversity of different organisms, okay? So as they branch off, it's representing how they're changing. With the youngest twigs, the ones down here, representing the most recent divergent or branching off. So let's briefly talk about artificial selection before we get in depth into natural selection. Artificial selection is when man intercedes and controls which organisms mate. For example, the wild mustard weed. It has been artificially selected for certain desired traits, such as long leaves and kale. So Darwin was influenced by Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus wrote an essay in 1798 that said there was potential for human populations to increase faster than food supplies and other resources. And it also said that if heritable traits have an advantage, they will accumulate in a population over time and will increase the frequency of individuals with those traits. So natural selection is differential success in reproduction, which means some are more successful at reproduction and some are less. So individuals with certain heritable characteristics are going to reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. The results are due to interaction between individuals and themselves and individuals and their environment. Now, natural selection can produce a change over time. If an environment changes, this can result in an adaptation to this new condition. For example, these two praying mantis species are from the same family but have different adaptations because of the environment. It is important to note that individuals do not evolve. It is the populations that evolve over time. Do not forget, an individual does not evolve. Also, it is important to note that natural selection can only increase or decrease heritable traits that vary in a population. And of course, adaptations vary with different environments. So Darwin's theory of evolution continues to be tested in a variety of different ways, and new discoveries continue to fill the gaps. There are many different examples that provide evidence for natural selection. Let's explore a few. So Resnick and Eldon conducted an experiment with guppies that provides evidence for natural selection. Guppies that live in different environments are different sizes at sexual maturity based on the predator. Pike cichlid prey on large sexual mature guppies, while killfish prey on small sexual mature guppies. So when the predator in the environment is pike cichlid, the guppies are small. While when the predator in the environment is killfish, the guppies are large to avoid being eaten. So Resnick and Eldon transplanted guppies from the pike cichlid pools to the killfish pools and measured the average size of guppies at sexual maturity. So over time, on about an 11-year period, they saw that the guppies that were transplanted into the killfish pool got larger at sexual maturity than those in the pike cichlid pools to prevent from being eaten. Here is the data. From it can be concluded that the change in predator caused the different adaptation in the population to be favored. Another example that provides evidence of natural selection is the evolution of the drug-resistant HIV. As different drugs have been used on the different strands of HIV, mutations have been produced in the strands that makes them resistant to the drugs. Natural selection is the cause of adaptive evolution in the HIV strands to become resistant. Here's a graph that shows HIV in response to medication. On the y-axis is the number of HIV resistant to a specific medication, so the percent of HIV that is resistant to the drugs. Over time, the number of HIV resistant to the medication increases because they are the ones that are selected for. Another example that provides evidence for natural selection is soapberry bugs. Soapberry bugs use their beaks to feed on seeds within fruits. In southern Florida, they have longer beaks and feed on larger fruits. In central Florida, they have shorter beaks and feed on smaller fruit. And this same correlation between fruit size and beak size has also been observed in Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Australia. In all cases, the beak sizes have evolved in a population that feeds on introduced plants with fruits that are smaller or larger than the native fruits. These cases are examples of evolution by natural selection. So the soapberry bugs show how natural selection has selected for different adaptation in the bugs for different environments. So natural selection does not create new traits, but it edits or selects for traits already present in a population, and which traits will be selected for or selected against in any specific population are determined by the environment. Evidence of the evolutionary theory or natural selection includes homologies. Homologies are similarities resulting from a common ancestry. Homologies are anatomical resemblances between different organisms. For example, in this figure, all are limbs that have the same bone structure in the same order, but the bone shape and sizes are different because they are adapted to a specific environment. For example, flying or walking. More evidence for evolution comes from molecular homologies. Molecular homologies show how living things are fundamentally alike at the cellular and molecular level. For example, they have the same amino acid structure for the same protein. Comparative embryology suggests that embryos have anatomical homologies not visible in adult organisms because some genes that are programmed for certain things are turned on at certain times, so embryos form differently. For example, both chick embryos and human embryos have the pharyngellin pouches, which are the things that turn into gills in fish. More evidence of the evolutionary theory are vestigial organs. Vestigial organs are remnants of structures that serve important functions in the organism's ancestor. For example, the human appendix, tailbone, and wisdom teeth are all vestigial organs. Also, the wings in ostriches are vestigial organs. Wings are very complex structures that are specifically adapted for flight, yet ostriches are flightless birds. Based on the homologies that researchers have observed, they can create an evolutionary tree of life. Evolutionary trees are hypotheses about the relationship among different groups, and homologies form patterns in the evolutionary trees. Evolutionary trees can be made using different types of data, for example, using DNA sequences. Here's an example of an evolutionary tree. So, convergent evolution is when groups have adapted to similar environments but have different ancestors. So, same environment, same adaptations, but different ancestors. For example, the sugar glider and the flying squirrel are two mammal species that have adapted to similar environments but have different ancestors. We can use the fossil record to look for differences and make inferences from what we find. For example, from the different type of teeth, we can tell what an organism used to eat. Fossils can also document important transitions. For example, the transition from land to sea. Now, biogeography is a separate field that looks at where organisms are from and helps provide evidence of evolution. Earth's continents were formerly united in a single large continent called Pangaea, but has since separated by continental drift, which we will talk a little bit about later. An understanding of continent movement and modern distribution of species allows us to predict when and where different groups evolved. Last thing, endemic species are species that are not found anywhere else in the world. Islands have many endemic species that are often closely related to species on the nearest mainland or island. Darwin explained that species on islands give rise to new species as they adapt to the new environments. And that's it.